when Sarah Bennett, 8 months pregnant, was violently pepper sprayed by fake HOA officers. Her world shattered in an instant. These imposters, wielding power they didn't have, tried to intimidate her in front of her own home, and their cruelty was infuriating. But when her husband Jacob unleashed his trained K-9, everything changed in a heartbeat. Justice was delivered. But just wait to see how this shocking turn of events unfolded and how the law finally set things right. Part 1. Shock. In the heart of a peaceful suburban neighborhood, Sarah and Jacob Bennett were waiting for the arrival of their first child. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where everything seemed to move a little slower, giving them a moment to breathe before their world would change forever. Sarah, 8 months pregnant, was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, her feet up and her hand resting gently on her belly. She could feel their baby shifting inside her, small movements reminding her that soon their little one would be in their arms. Jacob was in the kitchen, making breakfast, the sound of sizzling eggs blending with the soft hum of the coffee machine. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation, a calm before the storm of parenthood that was about to sweep them both into a new chapter of their lives. They had just started to plan the nursery, picking out colors and designs, imagining their future together as a family. But then, without warning, the calm was shattered. A knock echoed at the door, sharp and insistent. Jacob frowned, glancing over at Sarah, who was already getting up, her belly making her movements slower. He hadn't been expecting anyone. When he opened the door, a group of 4 people stood on his doorstep. They were dressed in the typical uniform of an HOA security team. Cheap badges pinned to their shirts, radios clipped to their belts, and stern expressions that didn't belong on this block. "Mr. Bennett?" one of them asked, his tone more commanding than polite. "Yeah, that's me," Jacob replied, trying to figure out what this was about. "You've parked your car in a restricted area," the man said, pointing down the street where Jacob's sedan was parked a little too close to the curb. "You're in violation of the HOA's parking policy." Jacob was about to respond when Sarah appeared behind him, her hands gently resting on her belly as she walked toward the door. She could sense the tension in the air. "Jacob, what's going on?" Before Jacob could explain, the situation escalated. One of the officers, an older man with a graying beard, pushed past him and stepped onto the porch. "Ma'am, you need to step back inside. We don't want to escalate this." Sarah, trying to defuse the situation, raised a hand. "We're just trying to enjoy a quiet morning. Is there any way we can handle this without—" Before she could finish her sentence, one of the officers pulled out a canister and aimed it directly at Sarah's face. A blast of pepper spray hit her square in the eyes. The world around Sarah seemed to slow down. The first sensation was a searing pain, like fire being poured into her eyes. Her body instinctively recoiled, but the damage had already been done. Tears instantly sprang to her eyes as she tried to blink away the burning, but it only made it worse. Her breath caught in her throat, and she gasped, stumbling back. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The scene around him suddenly felt unreal. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, stepping forward. But the officers were unfazed, their eyes cold, as if they had seen this play out 1,000 times before. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching at her face, the pain overwhelming her. The world around her began to blur, and her breath came in ragged gasps. For a long moment, everything felt frozen. Jacob's mind raced. How could this be happening? Was this really happening? He looked around at the neighbors who had gathered outside, some peeking through their windows, others standing on their lawns. No one moved. No one said anything. It was as though the whole neighborhood was paralyzed, watching in stunned silence as Sarah, the woman who had done nothing but try to keep the peace, writhed in pain on their front porch. Her sobs were the only sound that cut through the thick, suffocating silence. Jacob stood there for a moment, frozen in disbelief. His wife, his pregnant wife, was on the ground, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. The officers, no, the imposters, just stood there, as if nothing was wrong, as if the pain they had caused didn't matter. He couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't process what was happening to the woman he loved. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a drum of fury. His eyes locked onto the officer who had sprayed Sarah, and in that moment, every ounce of rational thought disappeared. This wasn't just some minor altercation over a parking space. This was something far worse, an attack on his family, an assault on the woman carrying his child. "Are you out of your mind?" Jacob's voice came out low, but the tremble in it betrayed the storm inside him. He could barely control the rage building up inside him, hot and raw, like molten lava threatening to spill over. The officer who had sprayed Sarah didn't move. He simply stood there, as though expecting Jacob to back down. He gave a dismissive wave as if to say, "It's just part of the job." Jacob's fists clenched, his knuckles white, the sharp pain of his nails digging into his palm barely noticeable against the intense anger coursing through his veins. How dare they? How dare they treat Sarah this way? For something so trivial, Sarah's struggle to breathe seemed to grow worse with every passing second. Her body was trembling, her hands pressed desperately to her face as she fought the pain. The red, swollen marks from the spray were spreading across her cheeks and neck. She couldn't see, she couldn't even speak. But Jacob could see her pain, and it broke something inside of him. That's when it hit him. The full weight of what had just happened. They had attacked his wife, a woman who had never done anything to harm them, who was simply trying to keep the peace. And these men, these so-called guards, had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. "Get the hell off my property," Jacob growled, taking a step forward. His voice, once steady, now sounded like a threat. Deep, dangerous, filled with a fury that only a man defending his family could feel. But the officers didn't move. Instead, they smirked, the kind of smirk that comes with the belief that they're untouchable, that they can do whatever they want without consequence. It made Jacob's blood boil even hotter. "Just move your car and we'll leave you alone," one of them said, the words dripping with indifference. Jacob's hands trembled, not with fear, but with an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. He had never felt more helpless in his life, and it made him angry, angrier than he had ever been. This wasn't just about parking. This was about respect, about decency, about everything he had worked hard to build with Sarah. And these strangers had just trampled all over it. He took another step forward, his voice rising now, a low roar that echoed in the silence of the neighborhood. "You have no authority here, no right to treat my wife like this. You're nothing but bullies hiding behind fake badges." The officer who had sprayed Sarah took a step back, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he didn't apologize. He didn't even seem to care that he had just brutalized a pregnant woman. He just stood there, unrepentant, still sure of his own power. And in that moment, Jacob knew there was only one thing left to do. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It wasn't about explaining, about finding common ground. This was about justice. This was about protecting what mattered most. Without another word, Jacob turned to head inside, his anger still boiling in his chest, now replaced by a grim determination. He was done waiting, done with reasoning. He wasn't just going to let this slide. Not today. Not with his wife. Not with his family. As he reached for the door, one thought consumed him. They were going to regret this. Jacob slammed the door behind him with such force that the house seemed to tremble. His pulse raced, his mind clouded by the searing anger still pulsing through his veins. His hands shook as he made his way through the hallway, each step heavy with purpose. In the back room, the K-9 unit, Max, lay curled up on his bed. Jacob had trained Max for years, through the toughest conditions, the most brutal environments, and the most dangerous situations. He knew this dog better than anyone. He had seen the animal save lives, including his own. And now, it was time for Max to return the favor. The K-9's ears perked up the moment Jacob entered, and without a word the dog leapt to his feet. Tail wagging with anticipation, Jacob grabbed the harness from the hook by the door, the leather cool against his fingers. He clipped it on to Max with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. This wasn't a game. This wasn't training. This was personal. "Stay close, boy," Jacob muttered, his voice tight with tension. They moved fast. The door to the backyard flew open, and within moments they were both outside, charging toward the front of the house. The sight that greeted them only fueled the fire inside him. The fake HOA guards were still standing there, their smug expressions unbroken, despite everything that had just happened. Jacob didn't waste time with words. The moment Max caught sight of them, he surged forward like a force of nature, muscles rippling, his focus razor-sharp. The dog's body was a blur as he knocked the first officer to the ground with a powerful tackle, the sound of his weight hitting the pavement filling the air. The second officer didn't even have time to react before Max sent him sprawling as well, both men face first on the ground, gasping for air. "Max, down!" Jacob shouted, his voice sharp, commanding. Max immediately obeyed, stepping back, but not before one last growl of warning. As if daring the men to make a move, Jacob stood over them, chest heaving, his breath coming in shallow bursts as his heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed at him to calm down, to stop before things went too far, but there was no stopping it now. The rage had already taken hold. As he looked down at the men on the ground, their faces pressed against the concrete, a twisted satisfaction bubbled up inside him. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness. It all melted away for a brief moment. This was what they deserved. Jacob's hands were still clenched in fists, his body still coiled with tension, but his mind had one clear thought: I did what was right. The officers, now on the ground, were too stunned to speak. One tried to push himself up, but Jacob's heavy boot pressed down just enough to remind him who was in control. "You're not in charge here," Jacob said, his voice cold, devoid of any empathy. "Not anymore." The seconds felt like hours, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on Jacob's shoulders. His fury hadn't dissipated, not entirely, but as the officers lay in the dirt, Jacob knew one thing. He had done what needed to be done. This wasn't about revenge. This was about standing up, about making them feel the consequences of their actions. "Get up," Jacob barked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. But they stayed down. They had no choice but to submit, to feel the power of a man who would do anything to protect his family. Jacob stepped back, his anger slowly shifting to something else. But for a brief, violent moment, he felt something that he hadn't in years: control. The sound of sirens grew louder as the real police arrived, their vehicles cutting through the quiet suburban street with a sense of purpose. Jacob stood at the front of his home, his jaw tight, his chest still rising and falling with the remnants of his anger. His eyes flicked over to the fake HOA officers who now sat, handcuffed and dazed, on the pavement. The whole neighborhood had gathered, watching, waiting. Jacob could hear the distant murmurs of the crowd, but he paid them no attention. He kept his focus on the officers, his expression unwavering. The men who had once stood tall in their fake uniforms with their false sense of authority were now nothing more than criminals in the eyes of the law. The real officers stepped out of their cars, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. They didn't ask questions. They knew what had happened. The man who had been attacked had done what he needed to do. "Thank you for your patience, sir," one of the officers said, approaching Jacob. The others were already taking statements, processing the two men who had abused their power in a manner that would never be tolerated. "We've got this from here." Jacob nodded, but he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The officers knew the truth, and the reality was that there was no more room for doubt. The situation had been resolved. The real police were efficient, their professionalism cutting through the tension in the air. They moved quickly, arresting the two men and placing them in the back of their squad cars. Jacob didn't look away. He watched them being driven off, the wheels of justice finally turning. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Turning, Jacob found Sarah standing by the doorway, her hand pressed against her swollen belly. Her face was pale, but the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. As soon as he saw her, all the tension in his body seemed to melt away. He strode over to her, and without a word, he pulled her into his arms. She let out a soft sigh, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "It's over," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're safe." Jacob held her tighter, feeling the weight of everything finally lifting off his shoulders. He'd protected her, he'd protected their future, and in that moment, he knew they were stronger than ever. The injustice had been righted. The truth had come out. There would be no more fear, no more worrying about what would happen next. The fake officers, those men who had tried to impose their power over them, had been exposed for what they truly were: frauds. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Jacob's heart finally slowed. He could hear the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees, the quiet hum of the neighborhood slowly returning to normal. The chaos of the past few hours was fading into memory. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "For everything." Jacob smiled, his eyes softening as he gazed down at her. "No need to thank me. I did what I had to do." But in his heart, he knew this wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what they had together. This moment, their family, the feeling of knowing that, no matter what, they would always stand side by side. Justice had been served, not by the law alone, but by the unwavering protection of a man who would fight for what was right. And as they stood there, arms around each other, Jacob knew they could finally breathe easy. The storm had passed, and they were safe.